This is a Film Stories original podcast. Welcome back, everyone, to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I am your host, Tony Black, and I'm involved in this episode when I didn't necessarily expect to be. And it's quite a pleasure to be on discussing the second episode of the third season of the X-Files, Paperclip, a pretty legendary episode. And I'm flanked in this one by two luminaries. In fact, I'm going to go as far as to say super luminaries of X-Files discussion and analysis. Firstly, Darren Mooney, back again after the Blessing Way.
Hello, that sound you can hear is my eyebrow being arched very, very far, but thank you very much, Tony.
But you didn't thought you'd get called a super luminary today. I can't even say it now. I can't even say it twice. What
was the description you used the first? The auspicious Darren Mooney, I think? Luminous? The luminous Darren Mooney is,
I've got my thesaurus and my dictionary, and I'm just going for it. And joining us for this discussion, for this first, actually, I think this is the first three-way discussion on the X-Cast. For the first time on the main episodes of the show, apart from the Podwatch, it's Chris Knowles. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. And you can call me the X-Files Illuminati.
Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, it's really exciting to be on this episode with you guys. And before we start talking about Paperclip, which is a legendary epic of an episode, to round off the Anasazi trilogy, which obviously we've been hacking into, I realised that as we were inviting Chris on, that because this is the first time you've technically been on the main show, that you've never done the 5 questions of X, which is something we bust out every now and then when we get a brand new guest, even though you're not a brand new guest, you're a semi-brand new guest. But anyway, It's an excuse.
I've been sitting at the kiddie table all this time. So.
For the 20-minute episodes, yeah. So we're gonna do this. We're gonna kick this off. Now, a lot of people may already know the answers to this because you've written books and you've got your own blog and other podcasts and things like that. But this will be fun to go through. So Darren and I are going to quiz you on the 5 questions. So the best way to kick off is with the first one, which is, Chris, when did you first discover the X-Files?
As soon as the promos went up on Fox. At the time, my wife and I were real big Fox watchers for some reason. We were really into, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but we were really into Beverly Hills 90210 and Melrose Place and The Simpsons, and we really enjoyed watching the shows on Saturday night, which, let me try to remember, it was Cops, America's Most Wanted, and Sightings. And I believe that the promos for the X-Files first went up on Sightings. And I was really confused because I thought that the X-Files was some sort of spin-off of Sightings because, it was obviously covering the same material. And so I would, 9, 10, 93, 9 o'clock, I was there with bells on,
Yeah, that's great. I remember Sightings. I loved Sightings. That's I love how you've connected the two there. Darren, question number 2 then.
Chris, what is your favorite episode? Okay,
this is one that absolutely no one else but me cites as their favorite episode. But my favorite episode is Christmas Carol. The 5th season mythology that wasn't even included in the mythology boxes. But that was my favorite episode. I could elaborate on that, but that is my favorite episode. If you want to know why, I can tell you, but yeah.
I'm kind of curious on that. Well, I've got several questions. I like the way I'm going to press this, but is it just Christmas Carol by itself, or Christmas Carol and Emily? And what is it about Christmas Carol that sort of grabs you?
Christmas Carol by itself, Emily was very much like Terma Part 2 in some ways. It's just like, it was weird, like watching that episode, I just felt like, have we seen this already? For some reason, it felt very familiar. Yeah, Christmas Carol, and I'll tell you why. Because I, at the time, I had my first son was 10, and my second son was 5, and this was a time was very family time. My sister had young kids at the time, and we spending a lot of time going up to Boston for Christmas. And it was interesting too because it would always snow, which it started like the era of white Christmases. I think was that year exactly, and it was just a time that was very family centered for me. So it just felt very real. And the thing that I really tune into with that episode is that it really puts, for me personally, the X-Files in a very real world context. So you really begin to understand how this drama, this mythology and what's going on with the syndicate and colonization and so on really affects people at like the most basic human level. So it's very focused and down to earth, and I just really can relate to it. It just really hit me. And plus I was just like so crazy in love with Scully at the time, so that's another reason. And she's terrific. And Gillian Anderson is absolutely phenomenal in that episode. And I also thought that John Piper Ferguson was phenomenal and would have made a great
Spender-esque figure.
Well, he was kind of like, to me, I think he's like a proto-Doggett. I think that's where they were sort of like playing with the ideas that would germinate into Doggett. Sort of like a by-the-book, skeptical, knee-jerk skeptical cop, but who's still sympathetic. And, you could tell he was kind of crushing on Scully, too. So I felt like he was my surrogate in that regard, so.
It is nice to have someone defend an episode like that, because it doesn't get a lot of love.
Oh, and plus that last, I mean, the closer, I'm just, Emily is my daughter, just, still, I'm verklempt.
Well, obviously we're still on favourites, so what is your favourite season, then, of The X-Files?
Oh, 2. Well, yeah, it's a tough answer. Like, the first season, I'm terribly fond of, and just very protective of, because I just really felt it all. It was exciting and fresh and different. But overall, I would say the second season is my favorite, and I'll tell you why it's my favorite, because I felt that the mythology kind of became a little too how do I put this? A little too, what I've discussed with Darren is a little too James Bond, a little too cinematic, a little too, Robert Ludlum or something. The thing I really appreciated, and I think this is down to Chris, and this is something we can discuss with this episode, is the intimacy of the early mythology. How it just felt very intimate, and it felt very personal, and it felt very, intimidating in that regard. It just felt like it was on a very human level. And, when you start having, it was very exciting the way things developed. But, once things like the black oil came in, it's just like, all right, well, this is a different thing now. This is more like James Cameron or something than what I had been really tuned into. So that, and really, this three-parter that we're about to discuss, if I ever shut my mouth, is really, to me, it's sort of like the finale of, Chris Carter's interest in the mythology, what he was interested in. I think what he was interested in was with the politics and the personal politics and the human dimension of it.
On that note, then, who is your favorite character?
Oh, Scully. I mean, come on. Seriously.
Softball.
The series is about Scully. It's her story. She's the first character we meet, and it's really, the story is about her journey. It's her hero's journey. I definitely think that she was the character that the writers were most interested in, because she had the most potential for change and for development. Because Mulder was always just Mulder. He's always, his beliefs never changed. Well, except for that one arc, that short-lived arc. But he flew much lower. Scully sort of went through these peaks and valleys, and it's just her character development, I think, is just much more dramatic.
It's telling that loads of people answer that question by saying Scully. so many people and say Scully. Very few, oddly enough, say Mulder. It almost is always is Scully. So I think you're spot on. I think that's exactly what a lot of people feel, really, that it's her character that drives the whole thing, really.
Well, it's kind of like she's Billy Batson and he's Shazam, you know? I mean, Shazam's an interesting character and you want to know more about him, but, Billy Batson's the one who becomes Captain Marvel, so...
Now that's a parallel we haven't seen before.
There's a fresh perspective.
Yeah. Finally, then, of the 5 questions of X, Chris, what is your favourite moment from the entire series? If you had to pick one.
All right, this is another weird one. My favorite, my easy answer would be the confrontation with the well-manicured man in the cemetery in Blessing Way. But I'll tell you my favorite moment, and it lasts about a second, and to me it's just phenomenal storytelling. It's in Permanum, and it's when Duffy Haskell is in Skinner's office, and they're sort of grilling him, and he starts dropping hints that Scully, that he clearly knows Scully's story, and that he knows that Skinner knows that he knows, and Scully knows that he knows. The only person who doesn't know is Doggett. And when Doggett finally figures out, and he shoots Scully, this just like withering, piercing gaze, that's just, it's so filled with like anger and resentment and just like hurt. He's so incredibly, his feelings are just like he's wounded. Just that 1 second gaze says so much, and to me it says so much about like the series and what the series is really about, and the character arcs. I mean, even though it's not a Mulder centric moment or a Mulder Scully centric moment, just that 1 second, just when he looks at her, it's just, when you watch it, it just boggles my mind. It's because to me the greatest moments in the X-Files are silent. And they're usually like characters looking at each other, communicating with their eyes, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a great one. It makes me want to go back to Permanum now and watch it and capture that again.
I'll just like when I'm watching that episode, I'll keep just rewinding it to that scene, because it's just like, it's so powerful, and Robert Patrick has those great piercing blue eyes that just drill right through you, and that was just phenomenal storytelling. And season 8 would probably be, season 8's definitely my top 3 favorite seasons. So.
Yeah,
I'd agree with that. Yeah,
we all love it. We're big season 8 fans, definitely, 3 of us.
Frank Spotnitz is on record as saying that was his favorite season to write. So
we're in good company.
Interesting.
You can you can imagine. But yeah, great answers to the 5 questions of X, Chris. That's brilliant, and that's a good point to leap off and start talking about the bread and butter, the meat of the episode. So we're going to delve deep into Paperclip. Paperclip, as I said, was the second episode of the 3rd season of The X-Files. First aired on September the 29th, 1995. Is written by Chris Carter and was directed by Rob Bowman. And this episode obviously picks up from the end of the Blessing Way, where Scully and Skinner have guns on each other, and bash, in comes Mulder, and they're off on a mission to explore the secrets of Bill Mulder's past, of the Smoking Man's past, of the Syndicate, and secrets are very much revealed in this episode. So, this is one of the most well-known and beloved episodes, I think, of the X-Files. But Darren, you first. Out of 10, what would you rank Paperclip?
This would be a very solid 8, if not even a 9. I really, really love this episode. It's fantastic. It's one of the great mythology episodes. It's not my personal favourite, because I think I've gone on record and said that my personal favourite, like Nicey 731 and Patient X and the Red and the Black and a lot of the Season 8 stuff. But this is just perfectly propulsive. And I also feel like I was a little, maybe a little bit mean to the Blessing Way, so I have to be a little bit mean here. I can't play favourites that much. But yeah, 8 sounds about right for me.
How about you, Chris? Out of 10? I think I know the answer here. actually.
Oh, like 10 zillion. 10 zillion infinity Googleplex trillion. I mean, come on. You know me.
Okay, why? Go on then. Why is it like? I assume this is your favourite episode of the entire season, but what is it that makes this perfect?
It's all the set pieces are just so iconic. And if you really wanted to put together like sort of like I call this paperclip show, because it's like if you really wanted to put together like the best of X-Files, the most memorable confrontations and scenes, you could take a good 3/4 of paperclip. Because it's just so filled with just classic confrontations and classic scenes. And again, I mean, like the thing that really strikes me about this episode is just how intimate it is. It's just how it's characters getting up in each other's faces and confronting each other with their culpability. And I think that is a facet of the series that I think makes it so great and so memorable, but also gives it a dimension that makes all this crazy stuff seem just entirely plausible.
Yeah, for me, it's a 9. It's a definite 9. I wouldn't quite give it a 10 simply because I think there are episodes I love a bit more, but it's a high 9, absolutely, and it just never ceases to be all of the best things about the show combined. Really, all of the best aspects of the mythology, pacing, drama. Acting, it's fantastic. It's a really, really great package. So it's and the feeling is pretty mutual across the board. On IMDb it gets a 9.2 out of 10, and that's off 2,939 votes. And it's only the second highest rated episode of the third season. On that aggregate. So a lot of people agree that Paperclip is. It's up there. It's up there, absolutely. And it's just got so many layers to it, which I know we'll talk about. But it's a fantastic episode. So, I mean, to start off with then, let's get into talking about it. Because, obviously, it picks up, it starts off with one of the Albert Hosteen monologues.
Yeah, I love that character.
Yeah, before we get back into the cliffhanger. And it's again, I mean... Darren isn't a massive fan of the Navajo stuff. I mean, what do you guys think about this opening? Does it set the scene with Albert Hosteen and everything he's talking about, and the allegory and that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I sort of talked about this a little bit on The Blessing Way there. I think as a piece of storytelling, the opening monologue is quite clever because it sets up this idea of sacrifice and exchange and offering one thing for another and receiving it from some sort of supernatural entity in the world, and how that sort of plays into the idea of like Mulder who came back from the dead, and then you have Melissa Scully who dies, and you have this sort of, for one, everything that lives, something else dies. You have this sort of back and forth. And I think it's quite effective in that sense. I do think it's a little, and I know that I like Carter's dialogue. I like Carter's dialogue a lot. I'm actually quite sympathetic to his monologue. As I point out, the fact that you can do something like this on television is amazing. I do think that maybe it's a little bit too much for me in place. It's a little bit too cheesy. It's a little bit too almost stereotypical sort of Native American mysticism for me. But I'm willing to accept that maybe I'm a bit too hard on it in that sense. But Chris, what about yourself?
Well, I mean, put it in the context of when it aired. We're talking over 20 years ago. So I think that in that context, you're looking at something that hadn't become cliched and overwrought yet, at least in my view. I mean, other people might disagree, but I'm just incredibly fond of Albert Hosteen, and I think that Floyd Crow Westerman was a phenomenal actor and just had a charisma and a presence that I think added so much dimension to the storytelling. At any time that he was on screen, he just brought a weight to it that I think served the storytelling very well. So, I know a lot of people don't like the Native American mysticism and so on and so forth, but I'm just going to say, just completely, egregiously here is that I really connect to this entire storyline because my grandfather was very much involved in kind of Bill Mulder kind of activities of a sort. Actually, he worked on the real-life program that the Stranger Things was based on, which was the SAGE radar program, which had a they had the installations at Montauk, but also because his father was a Navajo Indian who had been adopted by a white family, and was actually born the year that Geronimo was captured by the U.S. Army. So, I mean, this is just completely just indulgent here, but it has like a personal resonance to me because I feel like, I lived it in some ways, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard.
That's a pretty amazing connection.
It's a connection that nobody else, nobody else, certainly, lots of Americans have Native American ancestry that they don't even know about per se. But it just gives that an added resonance to me. So, I mean, it's totally personal and indulgent, so I don't expect, you or Darren to really tune into that.
But I mean, I'd argue that most of great art that resonates with people tends to resonate on a personal level as well, so I don't think there's anything wrong with that, I mean, the movies I like, I can all point to for personal reasons that, I can't necessarily share or can't necessarily even articulate, so I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely, yeah. The other obvious thing about this teaser as well is that it does the classic X-Files trope of separating the cliffhanger action before you get out, before the credits.
The resolution.
The resolution. Yeah, and it does this all the time. He did it in... The Blessing Way was slightly different because it wasn't as direct a cliffhanger, but it does it in things like Colony and Endgame. It does it in things like Dwayne Barry and Ascension. And he does it here, and so by the time we're back out of the credits, we're back into the very final moment of The Blessing Way with Scully and Skinner with guns on each other, and it takes Mulder to bust his way back into the scene, reborn, to take down this this Mexican standoff.
Just in terms of that, it's worth maybe pointing out, like we discussed it in The Blessing Way, but like this is Carter very much subverting expectations, where it's like you're talking about like having that scene, like the teaser not being the resolution to the cliffhanger, and that sort of like being sort of strange in that sense. In a way, The Blessing Way is almost that, just extended to an entire episode. It's kind of like, I think there's something very bold in seeing that, and having a storyteller who's confident enough to actually go, not only am I not going to give you what you think you want at the end of Anasazi and give you something a bit more interesting, provocative, I'm also, even within this season itself, even within the episode airing next week, I'm still going to make you wait, a good 4 minutes while I articulate my thematic points before you get to see what happens in the context of like the cliffhanger that ended the last episode. I think that's great.
It is really good, and it gives it, I suppose, a little bit of breathing room. So when Mulder does bust in, it's you feel like you feel like it's earned. You feel like you've been waiting for this moment, even though you don't necessarily know it's Mulder behind the door at the end of The Blessing Way. But it makes sense given what he's been through for it to be him, and then to propel the plot into the next phase, which is really all about the digital tape. And it's that whole question. He wants the tape. He wants to get his hands on this truth, but right now the position him and Scully are in, Skinner insists on keeping it, and it's, for leverage. I mean, we talked a bit about the Skinner thing in the last episode, how he's portrayed over this three-parter, but this really is the episode where Skinner puts it all on the line for them, isn't it? He really does gamble everything on this tape, on the connection with Albert, in order to try and protect these guys. And in Paperclip, that becomes even more apparent.
There's a couple thoughts here that really drive home the power of the storytelling here, and that there are two subtexts here. The first is that this entire episode is really about betrayal. Every sort of scene that we go through has that undercurrent of betrayal, of intimate betrayal, of trust, strong bonds of trust being broken by betrayal. And if you sort of go back and watch this episode in that context, you'll see that, and it's the kind of thing that mental cases like me who will watch this episode, I don't know, 50 or 60 times will start to think about. But also with Skinner is that I'm not exactly sure how this played out. I'm not exactly sure what was communicated, because everything with the X-Files is subtext and undercurrent. But why is Skinner so willing to put himself out so far on a limb for these two agents who are really just nothing but pains in the asses? I mean, what is driving him? What is his motivation? Is it a personal motivation? Is it because he sees that Mulder and Scully are correct? that they're onto something, that they're unearthing something. He's a very by the numbers ideological kind of character. I mean, does he finally realize that his ideals are being betrayed, and that's what drives this, or is this some sort of paternal or even romantic attachment to these characters? I think there's just so much subtext that plays out throughout the series, is never acknowledged, is never spoken, but I think that there is a line of thinking that leads you to ask these questions. And it's sort of like what Kim Manor said, is that you really had to put your thinking cap on when you watch the show, because they're going to show you a lot of things, but they're not going to necessarily explain it to you. And I think that the frustration with a lot of fans is that they expect that payoff, that resolution, everything to be explained and wrapped up. And when that does happen in this series, it's always just like, oh, why did they do that? I like the mystery better.
That's part of the thing that, again, I think we talked about in The Blessing Way, which is that really after everything that Skinner does in this episode, the ambiguity should have been kind of gone, really. After this, if it's not clear that he's kind of on their side, I don't know what is. So it's one of those things where, the fact that they then, I think, Darren, you said this roughly, that for all the years after this, that they try and throw in a curveball with Skinner, is he trustworthy? You kind of think, well, yes, he is, because of this. Because of this episode.
You're still doing it in Kitten, for example, during the 11th season. It's just like, at what point does Skinner take enough beatings for you that you kind of give him the benefit? And I mean, admittedly, in Kitten, I think they do acknowledge that they should probably give him the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
But it's like, at what stage is there? But again, that's what Mitch Pileggi plays that so very, very well, though, that it's hard to begrudge them from going, let's see him do Conflicted again. Because it's like one of those things that he just has this presence which really, really sells, like, morally conflicted, sort of caught between the rock and a hard place, while somehow being both at the same time. It's remarkable, and I can understand why they do it, even if it does feel like over a quarter century, it's a bit much.
Just a little bit, but obviously they're out with of Skinner's got the tape. They're off, and they go to visit the lone gunman, because Mulder's got the photo which shows here his dad, Bill Mulder, the smoking man, a younger Deep Throat, and various other members of the syndicate. And I like to think that on that picture is probably Comrade Strughold from Fight the Future, but we don't quite get that confirmed because they haven't quite invented him as a character yet. So, it's, and Victor Klemper, who is the Nazi who was brought to the US under the real life Operation Paperclip. So this is one of those great scenes in the X-Files and great ideas from the real world, from real life history that comes in and is weaved in a really fascinating way. And it's, when you dig into the real life stuff about Operation Paperclip, it's fascinating and disturbing. And they kind of hint at that here. And, I think it's Langley who says, yeah, Klemper's still around, living well at the expense of the American taxpayer, even though he was putting Jews in pressure chambers and all this kind of thing. So it's pretty disturbing stuff that links Mulder's father to these kind of people, isn't it?
Well, that's as you pointed out, it's all based on stuff that really happened. So, for example, the real-life Operation Paperclip, according to the statistics I have here, transported 1,600 German scientists in the wake of the Second World War, and the results of their research conducted raised over $10 billion since. You have stuff, for example, you have like people who should have been standing trial at Nuremberg who are getting smuggled out, who are working at the US Department of Energy. You have this sort of huge connection that's sort of happening. You have even like Strughold, like, who obviously becomes such a key figure in the mythology, and it's a huge deal here because obviously it's the Strughold Mining Corporation. He is named for the Hubertus Strughold, who at the time, like in the summer leading up to the third season, there was a huge controversy around that going on because obviously he had done the exact same things that Langley accuses Kempler of doing, the real life Strughold, where he conducted low pressure experiments on Jewish prisoners and oxygen deprivation experiments on epileptic children. And in 1993, the Jewish Congress successfully petitioned to have his portrait removed from a mural at Ohio State. And in 1995, shortly before Paperclip aired, the Air Force actually took his name off the library at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas. And this is a man who, like, when he worked in the US was described as, and I quote, friendly and relaxed by the people who interact with him on a daily basis. I mean, 7 of the German scientists under Operation Paperclip were employed by the US Bureau of Mines to work in Louisiana developing rocket fuel, which may explain why you have the Strughold Mining Corporation, because obviously it's, you know, working with the Department of Mines to build rocket fuel that took the States to the moon, that took mankind to the moon. And you have this sort of thing that runs through the entire X-Files as a whole, but it's particularly strong in the 3rd season in the context of the Second World War and in the context of the legacy of the Second World War, where it's like a lot of the stuff that we associate with the American century, a lot of the optimistic stuff, Kennedy's New Frontier stuff, a lot of the idea of like mankind's aspirational reach into space, and the idea that as a species we can like transcend this globe and we can reach beyond and sort of like we can conquer or we can accomplish anything we set our minds to it, is built on this like horrific like betrayal, this violence that occurred, this sort of like knowledge that was garnered through experimentations on people in these atrocities that we teach about in school, but we don't teach like our complicity in that by using that information. And it's something that's very like, it's very fresh and it's raw, and it's incredible to see that first of all, to see it in a primetime television show at all, but see it in a primetime television show airing on one of the 4 networks in the 90s. Like, in mid-90s, this was Blockbuster Television, was teaching people about stuff like the Operation Paperclip and Operation Accelerated Paperclip. It's tremendous to see a story that weaves this in, and does it by, it provides the comfort of, like, alien conspiracies and stuff like that, but it's still getting at something like, this would have been how I would have discovered Operation Paperclip when I was a curious young boy watching television. I would have been like, that sounds interesting. Is that something they made up for this? That couldn't possibly be real. And then I pick up a book or an encyclopedia, and I'm like, whoa! And this is public knowledge, and this is out there in the open, but it's something that nobody really thinks about, nobody really draws attention to, and it's incredible to see it like woven into the fabric of like the X-Files mythology, into this big thing that became such a huge part of 90s popular culture.
It feels like one of those more successful sort of things that Carter does. You know, we talked way back in season 1 about how in space, when the Challenger disaster is kind of there in the storytelling, in some respects it's a little bit distasteful in the way it's done, whereas with this, even though it's a horrendous piece of dark sort of American post-war history, it's weaved in much better fashion in terms of how it connects to this fictional conspiracy and mythology. It works much better in an episode like this, which is all about the sins of the fathers and Mulder coming to realise, that his dad is not who he thought he was, and it's got this really personal, central, connection to even all this real world, terrible history that is woven into the conspiracy.
I'm wary about speaking too much generically about American pop culture when Chris obviously is on it and knows firsthand and knows a lot more about both the X-Files and American culture than I do. But I remember when I was doing research around this was around the time that you would have had, say, debates and protests around the presentation of the Enola Gay at the Smithsonian, which caused its own like minor culture war controversy when it opened a debate up about whether or not the United States was correct to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, or whether that was a morally justifiable, whether it was the only way to end the Second World War. And a lot of groups and a lot of people were very upset by the implication that maybe it wasn't, or that maybe it was a morally questionable act, or that maybe the Second World War, which is something, and I mean, well, I'm not just talking about the States here, I'm talking about like collectively as the Western world, and I mean even Ireland, which we were neutral in it, but we were kind of a little bit more towards your side. But as the Western world, the Second World War is something that we're very proud of. It's the moment where democracy sort of stood up to totalitarianism. And to sort of to see that questioned in the way that like the X-Files does over the 3rd season as a whole. I mean, it does it again in Nicey, it does it again in Piper Brew and Apocrypha. That was really powerful for me as somebody watching television, in the 90s, or who hadn't really seen these ideas and certainly didn't expect to see them in something that was as kind of popular and as accessible and as hip and as a happening as this. But I don't want to speak too much because that's, I don't really know. I just know from reading and stuff. But what about you, Chris? Is that fair? Or?
Well, let me tell you what I'm thinking. I'm thinking, and this is actually something that just sort of occurred to me while I was mentally preparing for this chat here, is that when they go into the mine, what they're really confronted with is the real X-Files. I'm not exactly sure if Carter really was processing that consciously, but okay, so they're running around chasing these little monsters and ghosts and witches and you name it for the past couple seasons, just having these little Kolchak adventures, and then what they're confronted with is like real monsters, real horror, real atrocity in this mine, because they see that these people who we were told to trust have been collecting the most intimate information on us. And of course, this is not history. This is happening to this day, of course. You've heard about, obviously, all the things that the, data mining and the internet, but also we're hearing these stories now about all these DNA collectors and all these companies that, solicit your cheek scrapings for, ethnicity tests and so on, or, using this data and selling this data. So, I mean, this is not history. I don't see Paperclip as like, oh, well, wasn't all this stuff horrible? But, don't worry, it's over now, and we can just sort of put it to bed. It's like, no, it's much more pervasive and invasive than it ever has been. So anyway, like, really what I see here is that, again, I'm not exactly sure how conscious this was or how this was discussed, but it's like, it's almost like this metastatic, cancerous version of Mulder's office that they find in this underground lair is, again, it's it's very humbling to these characters, because they thought that they were somehow making a difference by collecting all this information that would somehow lead to the revelation of the truth, quote unquote. But really what they're being confronted with is this behemoth that is so much larger than they could ever dream of being, and has done data collection and information gathering on a scale that is unimaginable. And I think not only is this interesting for the arc of the characters in context of the series, but it's also, again, it's gives us sort of a sneak preview of the way the world is developing now. I mean, I don't see that the kind of themes that they were exploring in this story to be, that was unfortunate and mistakes were made, so on and so forth. But we've learned from it and moved on. It's like, no, we haven't. It's the people behind all this just got a lot better at getting away with it, in my estimation.
I mean, one of the lines that sort of jumped out at me watching it this time, and again, this is the great thing about watching the X-Files, is like, I literally just helped Tony do a pod watch, so I've watched the whole thing beginning to end, and now I'm going back and watching again, and I'm finding new stuff in there even now, which is a testament to the show. But like, one of the lines that jumped out at me was like the bit where the well-manicured man was talking about how, you've built a database of basically the DNA of every person in the United States, and Mulder's like using the smallpox vaccine. And why that jumped out at me now is basically what Chris alluded to there, which is stuff like, say, the arrest of the Golden State Killer, and there was another killer or sort of assault perpetrator who was found using the same mechanism, where authorities had basically gone through the genealogy websites where people send in their DNA in order to basically track down relatives around the world. And they discovered that the killer had actually, one of his relatives, not even him, like a cousin or somebody twice removed from him, had submitted their DNA to one of these websites to track down their own relatives. The police put in the DNA from a crime scene, matched it, and were able to track down and identify this suspect using like these, these sort of private services. And I sort of remember watching that and thinking, literally the only thing wrong, and I'm not even sure that it's the only thing wrong given how little we actually know about the mechanics of this sort of stuff, but the only thing that the X-Files got slightly wrong in this idea is that the government would have to do it secretly, and that private corporations couldn't just ask us to do it and we'd readily do it ourselves.
That's quite a sobering thought, actually, because it does feel like we're kind of handing over these rights. I mean, right now as we record, I don't know how familiar you are with this, Chris, and all you, Darren, I don't know quite how it works in Ireland, but right now we've got the GDPR thing that's everywhere, which is the new EU law, which requires people to have to opt in order to give people access to their personal data, online. So now you've got millions of emails from things you'd even forgotten you'd subscribed to saying, do you still want to, be part of our website? Do you still want your email? And the great, somebody on Twitter made me laugh because they put, it's never been so easy to unsubscribe from things across the internet by doing nothing because you actually have to respond to say, yes, please, or whatever. But it's just an example of how this whole fear of personal data being corrupted, and even to the simple point of the fact that certainly in the UK there is not a day goes by where I don't get a call from either a call centre or one of the worst things has been a fake HMRC tax scam where they threaten you with legal action over the phone.
I've heard that
if you don't give over your and that's happened to me. I had it on a flight back from Rome, and I was just about to take off, and I checked my phone, and I was like, oh my god, I'm going to get back. I'm going to be arrested when I get back in the country. And then my girlfriend said, it's a scam, Tony. It's fine. And then I looked it up. But it's a scary thing that these people have access to your phone number, and all this kind of thing. And it's based on the fact that you've put in your details somewhere, and then it's bought by an external whatever. All this data is out there, and is easily corrupted. So it's a really pressing sort of concern. And it's like the kind of thing, it's another thing that Chris Carter, in a way, seemed to sense was coming.
Definitely. And it makes me wonder, realizing Carter had all these sort of connections and these little birds whispering in his ear in various agencies and whatnot. I mean, it makes me wonder what kind of information he was privy to. But I just wanted to steer this a bit because, the discussion with the scenes in the mine and whatnot, and we can get into the whole. Darren had an interesting observation, about the CIA death squads and stuff that they're confronted with. But the one thing that I really want to point out, and just getting back a little more in universe here, or just sort of in the mix of the production, so to speak, is really give props to Rob Bowman. And what a fantastic director he is, and what a great character. He gets all this credit for being very cinematic and really investing the mythology with this sort of cinematic sweep. But I think it's really overlooked how great he is with the personal moments, how great he is with the personal interaction, and especially with Scully. And there are just so many great moments here where Scully's character is rendered in a way that, I mean, I don't even know whether Carter or Gillian Anderson themselves, excuse me, would necessarily be processing consciously. But Rob Bowman just sort of brings this energy and this attention to the character. And there are just so many great Scully moments where her character and her, her love for Mulder, but also her, her strength within herself is really made very clear. And just to sort of bring it back to, you'd asked me about, these great moments. There's a, just to rewind the clock just a bit, but there's a great moment in Endgame when, Scully gets out of the hospital and she meets Mulder on the bridge. And he's watching the divers dredge for Samantha in the river. And just their interaction and just the way that she is so... She realizes how delicate this moment is, and how wounded Mulder is, and Gillian Anderson just plays it so beautifully, and it's just like why not? Why couldn't you tell me? All this kind of thing, and it's just so beautiful. It's just like it's rendered so perfectly, and I think a lot of that energy is carried over into this episode, and I think that's sort of the subtext later on, where Mulder and Scully and Skinner are basically, one of my favorite scenes in the entire series. This whole discussion they're having in the diner about how they're going to save their lives because they have this, this death squad after them. But I think one of the subtexts with that discussion is Scully's exasperation that she represses and internalizes, but her exasperation with Mulder's inability to see how seeing her sister in the hospital would be like really important to her, and more important than just like all this stupid stuff with MJ12 and all the rest of it. And I think that all this, stuff about the real life paperclip and the implications of that would really not have the same dramatic effect if it wasn't, again, this intimate, personalized dimension to the storytelling. And I think that's just really important because, in that scene when they're looking through these files and Scully's like, oh my God, that's me. Why do they have information on me? And then Mulder sees like the file on Samantha, but it was originally his file. I mean, I think these are moments that maybe a lot of fans will sort of gloss over and not really focus on the real life implications of that. These characters are discovering that what they're investigating is actually their own story. They're investigating, the story of their lives that they didn't even realize that there's been this drama that they've been a part of, that they've been sucked into without their consent. And one of the I don't know where I read this, but there was sort of like this whole fan perspective on the series is that this revelation, and again, this is a fan theory, but that Mulder and Scully were always under observation, that the office was always bugged, their apartments were always bugged, that they were, every word that they said was being listened to by somebody and reported to, somebody up in the chain in the syndicate, and that these characters thought that they were doing something on their own volition to try and save the world, but then realizing that they were just playing a part in a drama that had probably been scripted before they were even born. And I think, again, that's what gives this series and that scene in the mines just so much power and just so much, I think, a sense of tragedy. I think this episode is unbelievably tragic because it shows that the bravery of these characters, particularly Mulder, Scully, and Skinner, the bravery of their characters is really, I don't want to say it's futile, but it's pretty damn close.
What Chris is saying there, actually, which is very important and very pointed, which is that you can't look at the X-Files purely as a political or historical document, or even as a political commentary. And I think sort of we touched on this when we talked about the mythology before, but I think Chris sort of really brings it out there. There's an aspect of mythology that is practically Freudian, that's almost like it's very personal, it's very intimate. Like, this is a story about a son and a daughter, reconciling with their parents' generation, but also reconciling kind of with their parents. I mean, it's telling that, like, when Klemper is talking about like the great minds of the 20th century, he mentions obviously Freud, Salk, Crick, and Watson, but the first name that he mentions is Freud, and like Chris alluded to earlier on, the journey into the mines is very much a journey into like another form of the X-Files, but it's also this sort of Freudian journey into like an inner cave, which has this sort of like Campbellian sort of quality of like, the source of internal knowledge. And it does become a source of internal knowledge because obviously Mulder discovers there something about his family that he never knew, that that Samantha was taken, first of all, with the consent of his father, but also that he was meant to be taken instead, and it was his father's choice that's at the last minute that Samantha be taken instead of him. And you have Scully discovering that she's in there as well, and you have, like, as much as this is this sort of epic story about American history, it's also something much more intimate, something much more relatable. It's Mulder sitting on the edge of his mother's bed, demanding to know, did his father make her choose? Did his father have a favorite child? Did she have a favorite child? And trying to make sense of that and trying to bring it back together. And you're right that it's actually a big important thing running through the episode with Scully wanting to get back to see Melissa, but not making it. Because, I mean, even in that wonderful scene that Chris alluded to, you have Scully pointing out that Mulder, while he's on the run, while he's dodging all these death squads, he didn't even get to attend his father's own funeral. He hasn't made peace with the fact that his father's gone. It is this very intimate, this very sort of emotional character drama that like works on this almost like symbolic sort of Jungian almost sort of level of like metaphor and sort of and symbolism. And it kind of, I suspect that's like, it's easy to get caught up in the politics of the mythology and like the way that reflects American history. But part of me suspects that like Chris is entirely correct when he says that, or when, maybe I'm reading too much into what Chris is saying, but when he sort of suggests that like one of the reasons why the show became so popular is because it resonated and sort of hit on this sort of archetypal kind of quality. Like, I mean, Star Wars, for example, in the 70s kind of spoke to an entire generation of people sort of, you know, kind of coming to terms both culturally but also personally. Like, it means, I know that the Star Wars films means a lot to people who of a certain age saw it and sort of reconciling with their parents and their own fathers. And I mean, I think that the X-Files does something quite similar, where it's like, as David Duchovny, watching David Duchovny as Fox Mulder, like trying to reconcile with his father, ignoring all the stuff about aliens, ignoring all the stuff about hybridization, just trying to come to terms with who his father is and how his family turned out. I think there's a lot of raw emotional power in there that Carter doesn't always get credit for writing, because I mean, you know, even on this podcast, we point out like Carter's tendency towards monologues, but he really understands the psychology of these characters. He really understands what drives them, and he uses them to tell a story that resonates in a very broad way, in a very archetypal way. And I think that it's important. I think Chris is right that it's important not to overlook that when discussing this entire trilogy, but Paperclip in particular.
Yeah, it's funny because I always remember people, maybe with some level of, you know, sarcasm or whatever, but I remember people saying, you know, that this trilogy is like the Star Wars of the X-Files. You know, it really is that whole very condensed journey of the original Star Wars trilogy. Of a man discovering that his father is not who he thought he was, and then having to come to terms with who he is. And obviously, you know, there's a lot left far more open than things were at, say, at the end of the Return of the Jedi. But it is a similar kind of mythic journey, definitely, that he goes on through this episode. Mulder does, in particular. Genuine question: Why do you think he changed his mind? Presumably, Bill Mulder, because if it was originally supposed to be Mulder, then why did he change his mind and send Samantha instead? Just out of pure curiosity.
Well, that's, you know, another subtext that's sort of revealed towards the end. It's like, I always wondered if, like, Bill Mulder was shooting blanks and knew that these kids weren't actually his, because we get sort of a sense in Redux 1 that both these children were Smoking Man's. You know, the way he sort of clutches that photo of the young Fox and the young Samantha to his bosom before he's shot. I think that I think there's a subtext there that could probably be explored in a little bit greater depth, but and that's, you know, I mean, another great moment. Like, all my favorite moments really have to do with, like, confrontation and betrayal, I would say, because, you know, that great moment in Demons when Mulder confronts his mother about, you know, who his real father is, and she refuses to answer. And you know, David, I think, is brilliant in that scene, because David is, when he's engaged, when he's interested in what's going on in the storytelling, he can be rather brilliant, and I think he's rather brilliant in that. And I think he's rather brilliant in this, you know, particularly in that scene again in the diner. So I think that you know, we haven't really discussed Smoking Man, and, you know, of course, he's very crucial to this whole thing. And you know, what Darren has pointed out is just, you know, really what kind of almost like a farcical character he is in so far as his incompetence. That, you know, he's always just bungling things up, and the people he hires are always bungling things up, and they're bungling things up throughout this episode. I mean, he can't even competently kill off Krychek. So I think that's a very interesting subtext here. But, you know, he has the weight of this organization, so he's very dangerous. But, you know, again, this whole idea of confrontation, I mean, there's just so many great scenes in this episode. It's just astonishing to me. But, you know, the confrontations between Smoking Man and Skinner, and the way Skinner just sort of sizes up Smoking Man the way, you know, a fighter would, that he sort of just sizes him up, gets his measure, and realizes that this guy's just a coward, that he's just a bully and a coward and a sociopath. But, you know, you take away the power of this organization, and you could just, you know, this guy's just, he's nothing. He's just you know, weed blowing in the wind, and that, I think, gives that, you know, that final confrontation, no matter how, you know, it might strain credulity in some contexts. You know, I just think it's a bluff. I think it's just a flat-out bluff, because Skinner has sort of sized up Smoking Man and realizes that he's a coward, and, you know, any kind of bluff is going to rattle him, because, this is a man who lives his life in fear, as we hear at the end of this season. So I think that, getting back to this whole thing with Samantha, I think there's a very complicated family dynamic here that, probably hasn't been explored in some regards, but I think that it is, it's a very telling subtext, because I think it sort of points to just how screwed up these families are, how dysfunctional these families are, and just how like betrayal is almost like the air that these people breathe. When you're involved in this sort of, when Bill Mulder says, you've never thrown in, their politics become yours. I mean, I think what he's really saying here is that, it's not only just the politics of like these sort of Nazi party ends justify the means, Machiavellian, Nietzschean kind of politics, but also the personal politics of like, I am above the law. I can do anything I want because I am part of this machine, and I'm not going to be held accountable for that. So I think that there is something there that I think really needs to be explored, more deeply, because I think that there's an intent there that, and again, I mean, Carter's never going to acknowledge it. Frank doesn't really talk about the X-Files anymore, so we're never going to really understand what's being said here. So we sort of have to go through these episodes and parse out the subtext for ourselves, I think.
It's interesting you bring up the Smoky Man there, because I think this episode especially continues the thought that Darren, you had in The Blessing Way about how the Smoky Man is effectively middle management, because he gets a big ticking off here from the syndicate, particularly the well-manicured man who's just clearly hates him, clearly thinks he's just an idiot. And that, based on the fact that he can't keep hold of this digital tape, which is really quite important, to the whole grand scheme of everything they're trying to do. And he really does get shown up. And then, crucially, you mentioned, Chris, the scene with Skinner. I think that's the one time you really see him terrified. When he says, "Have you got the damn tape?" That's real. That's real. Yeah. He's genuinely scared, because he doesn't. For once, he doesn't know which way the wind's going with this. He doesn't have some sort of plan in his back pocket. And when you consider where he's kind of ended up, not to talk too much about the most recent seasons necessarily, because we've talked through them so much over the last few months. It's quite nice to put a bit of clear blue water between them now. But he's become a very different kind of all-knowing, all-seeing kind of villain. Whereas in this, he's much more of a middle management, not very good sort of conspirator who keeps getting caught in a web. And that happens throughout the third and the fourth seasons, and the fifth seasons particularly. And this really sort of kicks that off, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing that I just want to say just real quickly is that, personally for me, putting a face on the syndicate, I don't know. It took some of the mystique and some of the menace away from this, because the episodes that scare me is when we don't see who these people are. We can't put a face on them. We can't identify them. We can't name them. We can't call them out. They're completely anonymous to us, and that sort of almost indicates that they're beyond reproach, but also beyond being able to counteract. So I think it's interesting how those themes from the earlier pre-Syndicate episodes are kind of revisited in Tempest, Fugit, and Max, where, the Smoking Man is not to be found, and Well-Manicured Man, and, all the elders are not to be found. And it's almost like, well, remember how much scarier it was when we just had these people running around killing people, and we don't understand their motivations, we don't understand who they work for, so on and so forth. So I just feel personally is that you never really got the sense that Smoking Man was in charge of anything, because we're told that he works for other people, and he's obviously like sitting in on these meetings, and the inference being that he's reporting to people, because the people who are really in power are not going to sit in Skinner's office during these boring meetings with FBI brass. So I think that he became a cartoon character as the series progresses, because it's almost inevitable. It's like, look at the Fonz in Happy Days, or look at Kramer in Seinfeld. It's like, oh, well, this character seems to work, and the audience always cheers when they burst through the door. Let's kind of keep working with this. And I think there's a little bit of that sense with Smoking Man, because Bill Davis is such a great actor and so charismatic, and just really lived and breathed in that role. But I for me personally, again, this is why this arc to me is almost like it closes out the, not necessarily the mythology, because I didn't even hear that term until much later on in the series' life. But it closes out to me the early, those first 2 seasons, the conspiracy, this conspiracy of faceless men operating in the shadows. And this season gives them a face and gives them, silly kind of names and so on and so forth. And, as much as I love these episodes, it just takes a little bit of the air out of that arc for me personally.
Actually, just when you're talking about that, it occurs to me that the show I think is very conscious of what it's doing in regards to killing off the old mythology and having the new one reborn. Like that, repeatedly through these 3 episodes, there's the theme of like death and rebirth. Obviously, Mulder in the boxcar, for example. But even the idea of the calf, and the idea that when you have the story that Albert tells at the start of this episode, where he's talking about how the gods basically healed the man by tearing him apart and then reassembling the pieces and binding him through lightning and thunder. And it feels a little bit even like the show is kind of doing that with its own mythology at this point, where I think you're right when you say the first 2 seasons have a greater air of mystery to them. And what happens here is that the mythology becomes, and you're entirely correct when you say it becomes a lot more like a Bond film, because these are much more blockbuster episodes. The point where, like, Klemper is played by a character who is a character actor who's popped up in several Bond films to illustrate and reinforce that. But you have a lot more running around now. You have Mulder jumping on top of a train. You've got a lot more impressive stunt work that was obviously foreshadowed by stuff like Colony and Endgame, but which sort of gets emphasized to the nth degree, like from here on out. And it feels like the show is very conscious of that reinvention as it's happening. I mean, I will admit I'm quite fond of this period of the show's history, running from like the 3rd through the end of the 5th season, where you have, I actually quite like, I understand the appeal of the conspiracy as something vast and unknowable and terrifying, and all the more terrifying for the fact that it is unknowable. But part of me kind of admires the idea or the shift that you get in these episodes towards the fact that, like, if the world is being run by a secret cabal of sort of all-powerful men, sitting in some nice dusty room somewhere, those guys aren't really doing a terribly wonderful job of running the world. They're making the world a terrible place, but they're not necessarily the most competent or the most brilliant or the most fantastic men. And I don't want, again, I'm wary of making everything about this political moment or anything like that, but I look at the state of politics as it is at the moment. I look at the state of, like, people who are apparently manipulating things, or who are, casting themselves as, like, the demons and the guys in control and running the show. And I look at that and I think that it's I don't know if I can swear, but it's a shit show. And part of me sort of wonders, like, part of me looks at that and looks at, like, the portrayal of the conspirators in these episodes and sort of finds something quite interesting in that idea that, like, if the world is being run by a secret cabal of all-powerful men, yes, they are more powerful than people like you or I can fathom. Yes, they have far more influence, and yes, nothing that you or I will actually do will, probably accomplish anything in standing up to them or stopping them. But there's also the realization that they really have as little idea what they're doing as we do on some fundamental level. And I find something interesting in that, something almost like subversive of the conspiratorial narrative. And I really like that aspect of, like, this stretch of the show's run. And I like that you get that with, like, the smoking man here being all panicky. The fact that, like, the well-manicured man, there's a really great moment when he's on the phone with Victor Klemper, and you can tell Klemper, the ex-Nazi, is like, oh, this guy is my best friend. Oh, I told him you were a very vanilla old man. And you have this reaction shot from John Neville, which is just like, and Chris pointed this out, so much is said without words, but you have this reaction shot with John Neville where it's just like, I'm talking to this guy. This is what my situation in life is. This is so distasteful to me that I have to engage in polite conversation with a man responsible for atrocities that chill my blood. It's just, and it's so effective and it's so powerful. And I like that aspect of the mythology, that there's a sense that this is a bunch of people who have, like, use their power to put themselves in a position, like, where they're protected and insulated. But also, in the grand scheme of things, aren't necessarily faultless and aren't perfect and aren't in as much control as they would like, as people would like to think that they are, or as people think that they are. And I find something very effective in that, and I think it works very well here. But
there's some interesting things with the Syndicate. There's one point where the First Elder says, after that conversation actually with Klemper, where the one-man cube man tells them that Mulder's alive.
He practically washes his hands when he hangs up the phone. He practically wipes his hands clean.
Yeah, he's so repulsed. But he says, the First Elder says, I think it's time we call our friends. Now, for a long time, who'll deal with this matter. Now, for a long time, given that in the cave you see a UFO unlike any other, actually, that you normally see. It's certainly not the triangular sort of shape that tends to become a lot more common as the show goes on. But you see what appear to be aliens, running around under there. So for a while, the question was, well, when he talks about their friends, this ambiguous term, is he talking about them, or is he talking about the hit squad, this CIA hit squad, this really ruthless hit squad who then turn up to try and kill Mulder and Scully? I think it might be obvious to a lot of people, but I think the older I get and the more I watch it, the more I realise that he's talking about the hit squad. He's not really talking about the aliens. And in fact, there was a point, I think it might have been Carl Sweeney who said it on the Basement Group, that the assumption is that the aliens are actually more of the hybrid test subjects that we see being gassed in Anasazi. So what do you guys make of that? There's some interesting sort of uncertainty there.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And I think that it really points to the fact that the Syndicate themselves are just like, they are middle management. That the people who are running the show, either, I don't know, in the sort of tortured path of the mythology, whether they are, the people running the show are the colonist aliens, or are they these, more highly evolved hybrids. It's sort of kind of left up in the air, and it almost seems to me that Carter and Spotnitz are just, throwing these balls up in the air and to be decided later. We'll figure out exactly, how this is going to play. We're just going to put it together a bunch of possibilities, and then we'll decide later which one we like best. So, there's a hierarchy here involved, that the Syndicate is middle management. They answer to whoever, whatever alien force you want to name, and that like these groups like the CIA hit squad, it's interesting, that they're friends, that maybe not the hit squad themselves, but, whoever the hit squad answers to. So there are all these, like, sort of interesting hierarchies. And this is really, like, a through line that is explored throughout the mythology. It's like, you hear a lot of talk, like, we all have to answer to somebody. We're all just cogs in the machine. And, Skinner is sort of tasked to sort of put forth these ideas throughout the series. So it's just really interesting that, it's almost like these people have no will of their own, and they're just playing out these dramas in the context of this machine, this giant, enormous machine that almost seems to run by itself. That, we're all sort of lurching towards this alien apocalypse, and there's nothing we can really do to stop it. Because, even the Syndicate, they end up getting fried, but they seem to be like, this sort of almost like a cartoon Illuminati version within the context of the series, but they're just functionaries. They're just errand boys, in the long run. So I think that is again, so much of this stuff just is never. They throw all this stuff out there, and they want you to sort of pick through it and make your own interpretations. But I think that if there is a fault that I would make with this series, is that they overestimate the patience and the attention that the average viewer is willing to invest in this. Because you see so much commentary throughout the internet. Why isn't this explained? Why don't they make this clear? Why is this all so ambiguous? And it kind of drives people nuts. But I think that sort of like this studious ambiguity is really the tone that the series is ultimately striving for. And just one more point that I wanted to make insofar what Darren was saying about this, that this sort of puts a cap on the mythology as it stood in the first two seasons, and then lurches towards a new mythology that's much broader in scope and more cinematic and maybe a little bit more James Bond. I mean, really what that entails is that entails the torch of the mythology being passed from Chris Carter to Frank Spotnitz, because starting with, I guess with Nisei, Frank is really driving the plotting with the mythology, that it's really sort of put to him, of course Chris Carter is very deeply involved, but it's Chris Carter is saying to Frank, I really like what you've done, I really like your ideas, I've got all this other stuff to look after, why don't you really start to drive this story arc and see what you can come up with. Because if you really look, I mean, Frank at one point said that, Chris, I'm not exactly sure what point it was at, but that he didn't even, that he wasn't even coming to the plotting meetings anymore. He wasn't coming to the meetings where, they're working the boards for these plot lines, and his contribution was, increasingly in the rewriting stage. So I think that's really an important thing to, that this is kind of a milestone, because this is, again, the torch being passed from Chris to Frank. You can't, the show has to progress. You can't just continuously play the same beats all the time. You have to move forward with the storytelling. But to me, when you move forward with the storytelling, that is necessarily a function of where you move away from, this very close, focus, intimate, personal investment in these stories, and more towards Hollywood, to put it bluntly. And that's not a dig. I mean, I love all that latest stuff dearly, obviously. But I think, that formula can really fail, and fail badly. And I guess Tunguska Terma is probably the best example of that, where it just flails in circles, and by the time it's over, you just have absolutely no idea what happened and why it happened. I mean, I don't know if you get that sense at the end of Terma that I do. So it's
and why it happened non-linearly.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem to make any sense. And I think that I think if there's something I regret about that what Paperclip marks, the movement from more focused, more intimate, more personal storytelling to more cinematic, more sweeping, more quote-unquote mythological storytelling.
The ending of Paperclip is very personal. The way it all comes together. With Mulder learning these horrible revelations about his father and everything that was going on, and what happened to his sister, and then and the fact that Melissa dies. And then you get that really touching final scene where it sort of resets the board in terms of where the series is going to go. Scully says, I've heard the truth, now I want the answers, and that's okay. Off we go. That's it. That's your season. In fact, that's the next few seasons. Really, that's the next 3 or 4 seasons set up essentially in that line. That's what they do now, and that's what the conspiracy / mythology episodes is what is all about. It's all about putting the pieces together now of what this is. Now it's all been sort of teed up, and that becomes the show really. So it's a personal, very broad ending that like you've both been saying, triggers the next stage of the X-Files evolution. I
agree largely with what you're saying. I think I'm a bit fonder of the stuff than you are, and I think you're right when you say that sort of transitions from being, and I think there's a very sort of like 70s like parallax view, sort of like All the President's Men vibe to the first and second seasons, and it doesn't entirely go away over the course of the rest of the run, but it does become a lot more 90s blockbustery, where you have like, they have a point in like the 6th season premiere at the beginning where they're joking about, I saw that in Men in Black, which was the movie that opened opposite the X-Files, or around the X-Files, and you're comparing yourself to 90s blockbuster sort of movies, except you're doing it weekly on television. I can understand that shift being jarring, and I can see it there, and I think that it does lose something in that. But I also, I would probably be a bit more fonder of it than you are. Again, I point out that, my favourite mythology episodes are Nicene 731, which is literally, it's the most Bondian or 90s blockbustery of those, like, conspiracy thriller episodes, in that it has, like, exploding train cars and impressive stunt sequences, and literally a race against time and a ticking clock. It's, it's very much sort of go sort of stuff, as opposed to, like, more introspective stuff. But I think Chris is entirely right here. I mean, I I think there's something interesting in the show itself, sort of almost dying and reborn in the same way that Mulder is, in that like there's a point of like it's never quite buried. It is very clearly the same show that it was in the second season, but it's also fundamentally different. And the show would obviously do this a number of times over the course of its run. It would sort of like die and resurrect itself. I mean, you could argue that it did so in the sixth season when it moved to Los Angeles and it became a different show again. You could argue that it did again in the eighth season after David Duchovny left and the writers had to sit down and figure out how to write the X-Files without David Duchovny. And you could argue that, again, it kind of sort of tried to do that in the 10th and I think managed to do it in the 11th, where you had this conversation about how you make the X-Files in the 21st century. So I think that like this is important because it's the first of those like deaths and rebirths, and I think it maybe even acknowledging like the limitations there and sort of the differences and sort of the gap between what it was and what it is. I think this is maybe the most successful of the show's rebirths, although I am very fond of the 8th season as a whole. But this is probably the purest sort of like the phoenix rising from the ashes, or maybe even just like the chicken hatching from the egg, in that it feels like from beginning to end, like I know Chris is a big fan of the second season. I'm actually, my favourite season of the X-Files would be this one, the third season, because it feels like a season that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, that clearly kind of, that builds towards something as it goes, that has like a consistent thematic through line, which is obviously the Second World War stuff. I mean, you could argue that like what Nicey and 731 do is they repeat the thematic beats of Paperclip, except this time with Japan instead of Germany, where it's like, oh my god, we welcomed a bunch of Axis scientists over here and they did horrible things to innocent people, and we use that information for our own scientific benefit, which is basically the same plot we've just watched, just again. But it does play through and it sort of simmers in different ways, and you have like a clear arc from like the beginning here with the introduction of the Syndicate through to the end of the season where it's revealed finally that, you know, what the aliens are planning is colonization, except it's handled so smoothly that it's not even really a reveal, because it seems like it's the only thing that they could be planning given all the thematic stuff that's been set up, all the little hints that have been sparkled through and sort of like seeded through the season. And actually I really like that. I think that it is a death and rebirth, but I think that what it's reborn into here, and like in Paperclip in particular, is just dazzling. It's sort of there's a confidence here that is infectious and sort of just carries me through, and sort of just that leads to what is one of my favorite 20-odd episode seasons of television ever. And it just I watching Paperclip, it almost like makes me want to sit down and watch all 26 episodes again. And it's a rare episode of television that makes you do that. It's a rare season premiere that makes you sit down and go, I want to watch all the rest of this. I think the only one of the few other ones that does that is the beginning at the end of the beginning, the start of the second season, Millennium, is one of those other premieres that makes me sit down and go, okay, if I don't do anything tomorrow, I can watch all of this. And Paperclip kind of does that for me. I absolutely love that about it.
Yeah, it's a tremendous episode, and yeah, we've covered it in quite a lot of detail. So yeah, that's the basic gist of Paperclip. But yeah, before we go, we're going to do a little bit of audience feedback, because we've had some comments on the Facebook basement group from some of our listeners and a few of our patrons and things like that. So let's read through some of these. There's some praise for the mine sequence in particular. Michael Little said, a classic in every sense of the word, talking about Paperclip. So many great moments. The highlight for me being the high adventure in the mine, which is a nice way of putting it. But Winston Pear said, entirely perfection, except for that moment when they run out of the highly secured mine through that rickety screen door. Which is quite a good point, really. We're never going to see it again.
At that, because myself and Chris, I think, may have actually talked about this at another opportunity. And I think I made this a point, but Chris actually came back I actually really like Chris's answer to this, which is a nice Darren punts the softball to Chris, because Chris actually made a very good observation about that sequence, I think.
Well, my observation is that it's so atypical of television, particularly television of that time. And to me, it's sort of Carter's perverse, subversive mentality, where, like, you know, another show would have this great shootout and, you know, this heroic self-sacrifice and speeches and all these things being made, and they just sort of run out the side door. There's something about it that I think is really quite brilliant. But maybe that's just me.
But yeah, more praise for some of the way things look. Katie Doe said the scenes in Klemper's greenhouse and the mine are some of my favourites in the whole show. The shot of the UFO light coming in the windows with Mulder silhouetted with Mark Snow's score is absolutely gorgeous. I completely agree with that, actually. That was one of the shots that you see quite often in the promo in the old days when they were on VHS particularly. You see it in the promos, and it's so cinematic. You mentioned earlier, Chris, about Rob Bowman, and every episode, and we've talked about this before on the Xcast, but every episode he does, it just has that movie touch to it in places, and this is a great example of that.
Yeah, and plus the acting, and one scene that we sort of overlooked, and is again one of my favorite scenes in the entire series, is the confrontation between Mulder and Scully and the well manicured man in the greenhouse, and I to me it's the entire arc of the storyline sort of being spelled out, but also just the way Mulder and Scully are like two kids finding out that their parents were serial killers or something. I mean, just the reactions and the sense of betrayal and loss that they demonstrate there. I just Scully, it's so overwhelming for Scully that she walks out. She just can't listen to it. It's just too painful. And again, these are the kind of things I just really wish Chris Carter was a little more forthcoming and less Sphinx-like and less oh, you figure it out in his presentation of the stuff, because I think not only would it ingratiate him more with the fans, but I think a lot of people who don't pick up on these things, it would sort of enliven the experience for them. And there's just sort of one point that I want to make, getting back to this whole thing with Smoking Man and Samantha and everything. And this is something that I discussed with Carl, is that this whole idea of like, was Samantha alive, was she dead, was closure somehow some sort of betrayal of these hints that they were dropping in the series. And my observation was this, is that the very first scene of the entire series is a girl who's abducted and found dead in her nightgown. So for me personally, when I go back and watch the pilot episode, Samantha was always dead. She was always dead. And I think there are sort of hints that play to that, depending on your interpretation. But I think that even informs this episode, because my feeling is that Samantha was always dead, that is foreshadowed in the very first opening minutes of the entire series, that Karen Swenson is kind of a stand-in for the dead Samantha, and the emotions that run through both Mulder and Scully, because another sister is lost here, another woman, another girl is lost in this storytelling. Again, it's not spoken, it's not articulated, but I think it informs the storytelling, and I think people like Rob Bowman sort of understood that and said, well, we really have to sell this emotion, we really have to make this work.
Mora Function Jaeger says, it's an exceptional episode. I absolutely loved the scenes in the greenhouse. The quiet serenity of that setting contrasted against conversations of atrocities and a mysterious conspiracy created such unsettling eeriness. Plus, Well Manicured Man is awesome. Definitely my favourite Syndicate member by far. So yeah, similar kind of things, talking about that scene, which is a tremendous, moment in the episode, and it's something that really resonates with people. Finally, Karen McKenna, she has a little bit more to say. She says, one of my absolute favourite mythology episodes from beginning to end. The confrontation between Skinner and Scully and Mulder in Mulder's apartment, where they have guns pointed at each other, is one of my favourite scenes in the entire series. The scope of the conspiracy really starts to come into view as we learn more about the Elders. Skinner finally getting the upper hand on CSM and getting him to completely lose his cool, and Skinner's best line, this is where you pucker up and kiss my ass. Mulder and Scully on their epic quest together, and she puts that in, quote marks, together throughout and not separated as they so often are in mythology episodes. The emotional family stuff with Mulder confronting his mom and Scully losing his sister and sending Albert to comfort her mother, which is definitely a nice touch, actually, and pray for Melissa when she can't be there in person. Krycek, the Well Manicured Man, the Lone Gunman, so much happening, and yet the themes of life and death, sacrifice and survival are all so clear and are mirrored in so many of the characters' individual journeys. It gives the episode such a solid emotional core, and I think she kind of sums up everything we've been talking about really over this last hour and a half or so. She really goes through all the beats, not just the the aspects, the fun aspects, the cool scenes, everything like that. But the emotion within this epic, storytelling. And I think that's something that so many people, when they watch this, really just take away. Everything we've been talking about. It is definitely a classic X-File, without question, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, thank you to everyone who commented on the basement group about Paperclip. Sorry we couldn't read all of them out, but we really appreciate you commenting. Keep doing that, okay, for every episode that goes up now. Not all, like I said last time, not all of them are going to have necessarily comments, but we're going to do our best to keep those in as many episodes being recorded going forward. So do let us know your thoughts, because it's always really interesting to read these out and to see what you guys think. So yeah, that's it. Paperclip. All done. That's the Anasazi trilogy, the unopened file, whatever you want to call it, in the bag, put to bed. So it's onward into season 3 now. But yeah, it's been a real thrill to be on this episode with you guys. So before we wrap up, tell us where we can find you. Darren, you go first. Where do you want to direct people to for more Darren Mooney?
Well, I mean, if you're walking down the street and you have to see a handsome man with a goatee, no, you can follow me online at Darren_Mooney. You can find me at the Movie Blog, spelled with a 0 instead of an O in movie. I co-host the podcast The 250, look at the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time, and I co-host the Scanon podcast, which is an Irish-based podcast looking at the week in film coverage. So there's more than enough Darren for anybody. Your recommended daily allowance of Darren should be well surpassed by this point. Cheers. And Tony, also just thank you very much. It has been an absolute pleasure on my part to be involved in this in any way, shape or form. Thank you. And obviously Chris as well. It's been a huge pleasure.
That's very kind. Yeah, it's always brilliant to have you on. Chris, what about you? Where are you lurking online?
Oh, I'm all, hither and yon, but you can probably just, if you're trying to track me down, just go to secretsun.blogspot.com and read my lunatic ravings on quite regular basis.
Fascinating ravings,
yeah.
I would say.
And there's an X-Files tag there. If it says Chris Carter X-Files because I'll talk about Millennium. I've done a lot of writing on Millennium, which I think is just criminally underrated and overlooked series that
I will second that.
Yeah, that I think really puts a lot of the themes explored in X-Files into maybe a little bit more real world kind of context. But
underrated not for much longer, because the time is now. Is coming, guys. Our spin-off podcast. So we'll be doing Millennium in the not too distant future, and I know that Darren and Chris will both be involved in that in some fashion. So yes,
yeah, really looking forward to that. I think the series was just so incredibly influential, which I think is overlooked as well. You had entire franchises that launched themselves by imitating Millennium.
Yeah,
so
it's true.
There you go.
It's a marvelous show. So yeah, we're getting into that as well as the X-Files. So it'll be great to have you guys back on the Xcast at some point. You can obviously find me if you want to find me. You can find me at AJ Blackwriter on Twitter, and all the details of where we are and what we're doing in the show will be in the credits if you want to listen on to more of my dulcet tones. So we'll be back very soon for DPO is coming next, which is the Lightning Boy episode, as we're back onto the normal kind of standalones, and Carl Sweeney and Andrew Blake will be joining you for that one. So thanks for listening, guys, and remember, until next time, trust no one. The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and presented by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated group of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find us on Twitter at the Xcast, and on Facebook if you type in the Xcast, or at our group X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, where you can continue the discussion about all things Mulder and Scully. If you want to support the Xcast further, you can now subscribe and become a patron of the show on Patreon. On Google, just type patreon.com/the Xcast. That's Patreon. You'll see all of our tiers, subscription options and perks, which include early access to episodes, bonus content such as commentaries on X-Files episodes, access to a patron chat zone, and even appearing on one of our patron roundtable discussions. We would appreciate any support you can give the show, so just go to patreon.com/the Xcast to find out more. Our title music is provided courtesy of Will A, who you can find on Twitter at I am Will A Y E.